about trying Emboss Resist but not sure where to start? Well, today's video shows you multiple ways you can use Emboss Resist in your paper crafts, from a simple background to more focal elements with a more advanced technique. This video features 4 techniques, but bear in mind there are many out there to try, and we hope you find some inspiration with these 4 cards. I'm Verity and welcome to my channel. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on my next video. The first card uses simple ink blending for a background with Emboss Resist. This background stamp is the pinstripe background from Autonew, and this was stamped onto a piece of navy cardstock using clear, ultra slow drying embossing ink from Wow. This was then covered with rich gold pale embossing powder and heat set using the dual speed heat gun from Wow. The colour of this powder when it melts is just gorgeous. So we're now going to do the Emboss Resist. Using distress oxides and blending brushes, apply ink to one end of your cardstock. Now I started off with chipped sapphire, but it wasn't really that much darker than my actual cardstock in the end, so it's not necessarily that noticeable to begin with. I later go on and add black soot to increase the contrast in the colours so I get a darker colour to the cardstock. As you blend the ink on, the ink will go onto your cardstock but will layer over the top of your embossing. However, as the embossing isn't porous, the ink will just sit on top of this. So use a dry cloth to wipe the ink off and buff the powder up again so you get the colour coming back through. I also added some tumbled glass to the top of the cardstock to get a greater ombre effect and faded this down to the darker colour within the cardstock. Once you've added the ink, just remember you need to always wipe it away and buff it with a dry cloth just to bring that embossing sheen back to life. This panel was then adhered to a light grey blue card base, and a happy birthday sentiment from My Favourite Things was added along with foam die cut letters underneath, just to add a little bit more dimension. And to finish the card off, a few Nuvo drops in white and platinum were added as embellishments. So for the next technique, this uses a similar process as before, ink blending on a background. However, instead of using a coloured or metallic or opaque embossing powder, we're just going to use clear gloss. So the leaves from the skeleton leaf stamp set from Gina Case Designs was then repeatedly stamped in embossing ink over some sea glass cardstock. Then this was covered with clear gloss embossing powder from Wow. So once this heat set, you get a lovely tone-on-tone embossed background as the clear gloss darkens the colour of the cardstock where it is. However, it also traps this colour of the cardstock. So if we apply ink over the top, the leaves retain the colour of the card, but we will then get a lovely faded ombre background. This is great if you don't have many embossing powder colours in your collection and do have clear gloss to hand. So I used a selection of coloured inks from Catherine Paula Designs in Fiesta Blue, Daydream and Juniper Mist for another ombre background. So again, the ink is going to sit on top of the clear gloss embossing powder, but as it's not porous, you can take a dry cloth over it just to wipe the ink away and buff the embossing powder up again. There are several fun techniques that you can do with just clear gloss embossing powder, which we'll explore in another video. To finish this card off, the panel was adhered to a light blue-grey card base, and the big scripty thank you was adhered in white onto a vellum shadow die cut, and white Nuvo drops were added as embellishments. I was too impatient to wait for the ink to dry on the card panel before adding the drops, so they did soak up some of the colour from the card. The next card uses Emboss Resist to create a watercolour background wash as well as a well for watercolouring. A selection of stars from the Stars Above stamp set from My Favourite Things was heat embossed onto some distress watercolour cardstock with rich gold pale embossing powder. It's a good idea to stamp watercolour paper in a stamping platform to get a really good impression. This allows you to stamp a couple of times as the rough surface may not allow all the ink to transfer perfectly. So once heat set, tape your panel down to a hard board and apply a coat of clear water over the background. And using a selection of watercolours, just start adding colour to your background over your embossing. I use Sky Blue, Aquamarine and Sapphire liquid watercolour from Pink Fresh Studios. And you want to make sure your paper is wet to get a seamless blend. But if you prefer a more textured look to your background, dry in between your colours for less blending of these colours. The heat embossing will then resist the watercolour as you start applying this colour over, and therefore it's not going to affect your actual stamping. So when you're happy with the wash, dry the panel before you move on to the next part. Heat embossing can create wells as well within your stamped images. So this allows you to add colour to select areas without the colour spreading outside the lines. Perfect if you're not the best colourist and you struggle keeping colours from blending or staying within the lines. I use the same colours to add blocks of colour to the stars in the background for some more interest. So to finish this card off, a Little Inca Designs Celebrate was added in gold mirror card with a black die cut offset to add as a shadow, and along with the heat emboss sentiment using opaque bright white embossing powder from Wow. For the last card, we are using embossing resist to selectively colour in your stamped images. So there are these blending brushes that are on the market that can make ink blending really easy, but these ink blending brushes also come in different shapes and sizes, including very small ones, and these are perfect for ink blending small areas to add detail. So a selection of flowers and leaves from the Cherished Memories stamp set from Old to New was heat embossed in platinum embossing powder on smooth white cardstock. To start adding colour, take a medium to small blending brush and apply ink to the centre of the flowers, blending this out towards the edges of the petals. As you blend out, make sure you just lighten your hand to soften and lighten the colour. You can now add more depth and dimension, but using the smaller brushes in your set. So experiment with the different shaped brushes to add more colour to areas where you expect there to be shadows. But remember, go back over it with a bigger brush again to start smoothing out your blending. Also, but don't be afraid of the ink colour going out of your stamped image. If you fussy cut or die cut the stamped images out, this will prevent the stark white outline that you would get normally. But as you blend over the edges, you won't get this dark white outline. You may find this technique takes time, as it's a similar process to step 1, where we ink blended over an emboss resist background, but we're doing it on a much more smaller scale with the stamped images, and you have to just be a bit more patient. So to finish this card, make sure that you just buff over the embossing with a dry cloth just to remove any of the ink that's sitting over the top, because remember your embossing powder isn't porous, so it will not stick, it will not stay over there, you can easily wipe it away. To finish the card, the flowers along with some of the leaves were fussy cut out and foam mounted onto a white card panel, and a Hello layered die cut sentiment from the Signature Words dies by Old to New was added to the corner, and then the whole panel was added to a card base made out of Gina K Tranquil Teal cardstock. Lastly, some sequins from the Rock Candy Confetti mix by Trinity Stamps were added for some glimmer. These 4 cards have hopefully shown you 4 ways just to use emboss resist and incorporate it within your papercraft projects. Whether you take it back to basics with simple ink blending over an embossed background, or whether you step this up with colouring smaller stamps or combine it with watercolours. There are many ways you can use it, and it's a fun technique to try. So go and have a go and make sure you tag us so we can see what you make. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that bell icon to be notified when the next video is up. This was produced as part of my design teamwork for Wow Embossing Powder, and links are listed below. For 10% discount at the shop, just enter the code that you can see on screen. Why not check out this other video for more inspiration? Until next time, happy crafting!